In the year 705 AD, the Tang Dynasty stood at the height of its power, a glittering empire of poetry, trade, and unimaginable wealth. The Silk Road flowed like a golden artery, carrying luxury and culture from east to west. Within this radiant age, noble women held a status unprecedented in Chinese history. They wrote poetry, advised emperors, and draped themselves in the empire's most sacred symbol, silk. But behind that elegance hid something darker. For in a world built on appearances, honor was everything. A woman's reputation could elevate or destroy an entire family. Confucian ideals taught that virtue was a woman's armor and modesty her crown. Yet the very fabric that represented her virtue, silk, would soon become her executioner. Beneath the brilliance of Tang civilization, whispers spread through the palace corridors of noble ladies wrapped alive in wet silk, of the empress's justice that looked as soft as it was deadly. This wasn't barbarism from the outside world. It was cruelty born from refinement itself. The Tang court had turned its most beautiful creation into a weapon, transforming art into punishment. In a society obsessed with grace, there was no death more terrifying than one that used beauty as the tool of destruction. And as we step into this golden age, we'll see how civilization's finest symbol became the most exquisite instrument of terror. To understand how the silk cocoon torture was born, we have to look deeper into the psychology of Tang Dynasty aristocracy, a society where honor mattered more than life itself. For noble women, virtue wasn't just a moral expectation, it was a living currency. Their movements, their speech, even the texture of their robes were reflections of their family's dignity. Every thread of silk that touched their skin symbolized purity, refinement, and power. And that was exactly why the punishment that awaited them would be crafted from that same material, to turn the symbol of pride into the instrument of ruin. According to court records and Buddhist monastery scrolls recovered centuries later, the process began with deliberate humiliation. The condemned woman, often a court lady accused of moral corruption or disloyalty, was stripped of her garments before the royal court. In a culture that valued modesty above all, this exposure was a psychological execution even before the physical one began. Then came the silk, not the rough kind used by peasants, but the emperor's own finest weave, soaked in cold water until it clung like a second skin. Guards would wrap the wet fabric around the woman's body, layer after layer, from her toes to her neck. Every rotation was slow, ceremonial, a cruel parody of the dressing rituals noblewomen once performed with pride. Once bound, she would be laid on a marble floor, the palace doors sealed to keep in the humidity. Then the waiting began. As the hours passed, the silk began to dry. Slowly, relentlessly, each strand contracted with the precision of a tightening noose. The fabric that had once whispered elegance now hissed with suffocating tension. It pressed against her flesh, cutting circulation inch by inch, first turning her fingers blue, then darkening her limbs. The agony was not sharp and sudden. It was intimate, creeping, as if her own identity was being squeezed out of existence. But the true horror was psychological. These women were not ordinary citizens. They were symbols of beauty and civilization. To watch silk, their lifelong companion, become their killer was to experience the ultimate betrayal. They died not screaming, but often whispering prayers, begging for the blade they had once feared. A surviving Buddhist account describes one victim who murmured, "I can feel my honor leaving me with each thread." Her death was slow, lasting nearly 12 hours. When the silk finally hardened into a pale shell, the body inside was unrecognizable, a cocoon of privilege crushed by its own perfection. This was not just punishment. It was philosophy turned into torture. The Tang court had discovered a method that killed the body through the very ideals that had defined it. Beauty had become bondage, and with each execution, the empire sent a silent message to every noblewoman watching. Your power ends where your silk begins. In Tang Dynasty China, torture wasn't just about pain, it was about meaning. The silk cocoon method was never intended for peasants or criminals. It was crafted with surgical precision for one audience only: noble women. Why? Because to destroy a woman of rank, you had to destroy what defined her: her dignity, her refinement, her identity woven into silk. The Tang court understood that death was fleeting, but humiliation could echo across generations. Confucian society bound women not only by duty, but by appearance. Their beauty was public currency, their grace political capital. A noblewoman's clothing, posture, and silence were all extensions of her moral worth. She didn't just wear silk, she was silk, smooth, precious, and fragile. That's why the punishment worked so perfectly. It forced these women to watch their most sacred symbol, the fabric of elegance, become their executioner. The ritual began not in the dungeon, but in the throne room. The condemned was accused not of treason or murder, but of corrupt virtue, a charge that struck directly at her identity. Then, before courtiers and attendants, her ornaments were removed one by one. Her hair was unbound, her robes stripped away. The silence of the watching nobles was part of the sentence. She was no longer Lady So-and-so, wife of a minister or mother of a prince. She was just flesh. As the wet silk wound around her body, each layer tightened, both literally and symbolically. Every revolution erased another layer of her status. By the time the final sheet enclosed her throat, she was no longer a person of rank. She was a warning. Witnesses recorded the psychological collapse with fascination. Some victims laughed hysterically before dying. Others prayed to the gods of silk, begging forgiveness from the very fabric that had once given them power. One Buddhist scribe wrote, "She was not killed by silk, but by the mirror of her own pride." The brilliance of this cruelty lay in its contradiction. It didn't mutilate, it refined. It didn't spill blood, it suffocated grace. The silk cocoon became both a tomb and a statement. Beauty and power are inseparable from submission. And that was exactly what the imperial court wanted. To the empress and her ministers, every noblewoman's terror was an act of political theater. It reminded the empire that no rank, no virtue, no elegance could stand above the throne. The silk that once defined civilization now defined its control, wrapping not just bodies, but an entire class in the softest chains imaginable. To understand how the silk cocoon torture evolved from a hidden execution to an imperial weapon, we must look at the only woman to ever rule China as emperor, Wu Zetian. Her reign, 690 to 705 AD, was one of brilliance and terror. She elevated scholars, reformed governance, and expanded China's power to unprecedented heights. But beneath that vision of order lay a ruthless mind that understood something far deeper than politics. She understood fear. Wu Zetian ruled in a court built entirely of silk and suspicion. Surrounded by noblewomen, courtiers, and concubines, she faced enemies not only among men, but among women, rivals who mirrored her intelligence, beauty, and ambition. Executing them with the sword would make martyrs. Imprisoning them would make heroes. But silk torture? That was genius. It turned power itself into punishment, luxury into death. It erased rivals without leaving scars that could inspire rebellion. Court documents and Tang chronicles describe her method with chilling precision. When a noblewoman gained too much influence, perhaps a minister's wife or a favored concubine of her sons, Wu would summon her to the palace under pretense of questioning. The woman would arrive dressed in her finest silk, the fabric gleaming under palace lanterns. Hours later, that same silk would be soaked, wound around her body, and transformed into her coffin. Wu never raised her voice, never dirtied her hands. She didn't need to. The idea of the silk cocoon did all the work. Rumors alone were enough to silence opposition. Ministers whispered that the Empress's silk treasury was divided, half for the living, half for the condemned. And for the women of court, every gown became a reminder. The same luxury that clothed them could strangle them. One account from the old Book of Tang records the execution of Lady Zhang, Wu's daughter-in-law and political rival. Lady Zhang, known for her beauty and influence, was accused of corrupting court virtue. When guards came for her, she didn't scream. She asked to face the blade instead. Wu's reply was cold and unforgettable. The sword grants freedom. Silk teaches obedience. Lady Zhang's death lasted 14 hours, during which palace women were ordered to watch, a living lesson in loyalty. Wu Zetian transformed silk torture into a masterpiece of psychological control. She understood that ruling by terror wasn't about how many you killed. It was about who watched and lived to remember. Each death was a performance, carefully staged to remind her subjects that elegance, ambition, and pride could all become fatal when bound too tightly to power. By the time of her death in 705 AD, the Empress of Silk had created something more enduring than fear, a legacy. For centuries, no woman dared challenge imperial authority so openly again. Wu's brilliance lay not in conquering armies, but in conquering the mind, wrapping her empire, like her victims, in silk that shone beautifully before it suffocated. History remembers Lady Zhang not through her poems, nor her grace, but through her silence, the silence that fell over the Tang court as she was wrapped, alive, in silk. Among all the victims of Empress Wu Zetian's reign, Lady Zhang's death became the most infamous, because it was not simply a punishment. It was a performance, a lesson carved in terror, elegance, and control. Lady Zhang was everything the Tang court admired: intelligent, poised, radiant. As the wife of Crown Prince Li Xian, she wielded influence that extended beyond the women's quarters. Ministers consulted her, poets praised her insight, even foreign envoys mentioned her charm in their dispatches. But that same brilliance was her undoing. Wu Zetian, the empress who had clawed her way to power through political genius and ruthless precision, recognized in Lady Zhang something intolerable, a reflection of herself. Rumors spread that Lady Zhang's beauty and influence had begun to eclipse the empress's own legend. A whisper here, a compliment there, and soon Wu Zetian's court turned cold. When accusations of moral corruption and whispers of ambition reached the throne, The Empress didn't rage. She smiled. She had the perfect punishment waiting, one that wouldn't just kill Lady Jiang, but erase her dignity thread by thread. On the 7th day of the 9th moon, Lady Jiang was brought to a private hall known as the Chamber of Soft Justice. There were no chains, no blades, no blood, only silk, hundreds of pure white rolls soaking in bowls of water. The Empress's executioners, silent and trained, began their ritual. Layer after layer of silk was wrapped around Lady Jiang's body. It clung to her skin, cool and heavy, like a lover's touch, that turned to a serpent's coil. Witnesses described her composure, how she whispered prayers to Guan Yin as the first threads tightened. By the 6th hour, her arms had turned purple. By the 10th, she could no longer speak. Still, Wu Zetian commanded that the wrapping continue. "Let her die as she lived," she said, graceful and bound by silk. 14 hours later, Lady Jiang's body was fully encased, a human cocoon, shimmering in the candlelight. The chronicler wrote, "The Empress gazed upon her as one admires a finished tapestry. There was no funeral, no grave marked by name, only a sealed chest and the whisper of silk fading into the corridors." But the true brilliance of Wu Zetian's cruelty was what came after. She ordered every noblewoman in court to attend the next morning's assembly, each draped in identical white silk robes. They sat in perfect stillness, suffocating in their own silence. The Empress did not need to speak. The lesson was written across every fearful face. From that day on, no woman in the Tang court dared to outshine the throne. Lady Jiang's death became a haunting metaphor that in Wu Zetian's empire, silk was no longer a symbol of beauty. It was the language of obedience. If Lady Jiang's execution revealed the cruelty of power, then the silk cocoon itself exposed something even darker, the psychology behind the torture. Unlike the rack, the blade, or the pyre, silk didn't wound the flesh immediately. It invaded the mind first. It made the victim wait for death, feel death, and understand it thread by thread. That was its true brilliance and its horror. Traditional punishments in China aimed to restore moral order through suffering. But silk torture was different. It wasn't about confession or justice. It was about control. Each layer of wet silk pressed not only against skin, but against identity. The victim was forced to confront her own helplessness, stripped of titles, clothing, and the illusion of worth that had defined her entire life. In a Confucian society where virtue was public and appearance sacred, this destruction of self was worse than death. Court accounts describe victims whispering through the layers, counting the tightening threads, reciting Buddhist sutras to distract themselves from panic. The silk dried unevenly, sometimes quickly on the chest, slowly around the neck, creating waves of hope and despair. Victims never knew when the next contraction would come. That uncertainty broke the mind long before it stopped the heart. Even the visual design of the torture was symbolic. The silk was always white, the color of purity, virtue, and mourning. As it tightened, that purity turned into a shroud. The victim's beauty became the instrument of her ruin. Every thread reminded her of who she had been, refined, envied, untouchable, until refinement itself became her prison. Witnesses said the silence of the dying women was worse than screams. It lingered in the corridors, seeping into the dreams of courtiers and handmaidens alike. No one looked at silk the same way again. What once symbolized elegance now carried the echo of death. That was the genius of the Empress's creation, a punishment that didn't need blood to terrify. It made fear invisible, like the threads themselves. The silk cocoon turned beauty into bondage, luxury into execution, and the female mind into the final battlefield of imperial power. As the silk dried and the last breath of Lady Zhang faded, the Tang court didn't just witness a death, it witnessed the perfection of psychological warfare. Empress Wu Zetian's silk torture wasn't merely about punishing rebellion, it was about rewriting the meaning of beauty, virtue, and fear itself. The lesson was clear. Even the most refined luxury could become a weapon in the hands of power. But history never truly buries its horrors. It repackages them. The silk cocoon was more than an execution method. It was a metaphor for how societies turn their ideals into tools of control. In ancient China, silk represented grace and order. Today, control hides behind softer materials: image, reputation, obedience. The Empress no longer wraps her rivals in fabric, but the world still wraps people in expectations that suffocate just as tightly. Every era invents its own version of the silk cocoon. For some, it's social media perfection. For others, it's the silent weight of conformity, the fear of losing face, the demand to appear flawless while suffocating inside. The psychology remains unchanged. Turn beauty into a prison and call it virtue. When we study Lady Zhang's story, we aren't looking at a relic, we're looking at a reflection. The silk may be gone, but its threads run through the modern world, invisible, elegant, and deadly. History's cruelty endures not in its tools, but in its logic, the quiet belief that control is most effective when it feels like grace. And that, perhaps, is the real untold history.